It's Wednesday, February 8th, 2017, and this is KBIA's Views of the News. Our weekly roundtable on media behaviors comes to you from the Futures Lab studio at the Reynolds Journalism Institute. I'm Amy Simons, and with me are my colleagues Mike McKean and Ernest Perry. On our program this week, that Super Bowl game was something else. Call it a comeback, call it a collapse. The game off the field, though, was just as heated as the one on. We'll talk about the messages in the commercials and the halftime show, both those overt and covert. We'll also talk about the chilling effect that our current political climate has on satire, mainly because people don't seem to be able to discern between the difference between fake news and what is satire. We'll also talk a little bit about the latest social media company to announce its plans to go public. There's a lot more that hopefully we'll get to as well, but let's start with President Trump's claim that the mainstream media has ignored more than 75 terror attacks. The list spans from September 2014 to this past December and includes major attacks like the November 2015 massacre in Paris and the mass shootings in San Bernardino and Orlando, which I think we all can agree dominated the headlines in this country for weeks. The claim comes at a pretty curious time, too, given Kellyanne Conway's continued talk about the Bowling Green massacre, one that
never occurred.
Thank you. Thank you.
Well, I mean, what's really going on here, as far as I can see, is you have the president who wants to continue to have this sort of tit for tat Twitter war, comment war against the media. He needs an enemy. The media is and has been for a long time one of the things that he's gone after, and it works for him. But what you're seeing here is that the media is coming out and saying, no, we have facts. Not fake news, but facts to show that, yes, we did cover these incidents and we continue to cover them. And regardless of what you're saying, we have something to back up what we're doing.
Yeah, Mike, you were even telling me a little bit earlier today about how some of the news organizations have reacted to that and how they are backing it up.
Well, there's a couple of examples. CNN, for example, Anderson Cooper just went on the air and said, I was there covering many of these stories that are in this list. But I think perhaps the most definitive account so far from the New York Times, they took every single one of those instances that the White House mentioned, and they provided links to the stories that they covered. And with an exception of a handful of stories, they had covered all of them. And the handful were primarily stories where either no one died in an incident overseas or it was unclear whether it was actually due to terrorism or some other cause. And so I think that's a pretty good record. Now, I will be the first to admit that not every news organization covers all of these stories with the same degree of depth. We know that news organizations have cut back on their international reporting, rely more on wire services and the like, but at its base level, this is simply not true.
Well, one of the things that I think we also need to look at is where's President Trump making these messages? Where is he saying this? And so when it came to the fact that he's saying, well, the news media not covering terrorism, he was down at Central Command. Okay, today he was talking to the Sheriff's Association convention in D.C., and he went after judges. And you know, there's always this sort of tense relationship between judges and law enforcement.
I'm using the air quotes, the activist judges.
Yes, the activist judges. Yes,
air quotes here.
So I mean, I think part of what's going on here too is that he's making these attacks, either the media or someone else, in front of audiences that he perceives to be in his corner and against the people he's attacking.
Oh, I think it's interesting. Sean Spicer, the press secretary for the president, tried to walk this back a little bit by saying what he really meant was that news organizations were under-reporting these stories, not that they hadn't covered them. But I think even more revealing is when he said that the media were not giving these stories a coverage they deserved. Well, what does that mean? Does that mean they're not being reported on, or they're not being reported on in the way the White House would prefer that we do, with the whole narrative that it's all based on a culture war and that it's radical Islamic terrorism? If you want to use that as the measure for media's coverage, okay, they're not covering it the way that the White House believes they deserve.
Maybe they aren't using the verbiage. Maybe they aren't talking to the sources at the White House or the White House's supporters feel should be the ones that are front and center in these stories.
Still, part of that comes down to the basic news value of weight. You mentioned that some of these attacks maybe nobody was hurt, maybe nobody was killed, that perhaps maybe they don't necessarily deserve the same level of coverage as a mass shooting in Orlando in which 49 people die.
I guess I would agree with the criticism, not leveled by the White House, but others, that when it's a non-Western country that suffers one of these large terrorist attacks, it tends to get less news media coverage. That's true. The other thing we might want to think about is, and we've talked about this on the show before, maybe on TV at least, the coverage sometimes is too much, too sensationalized to the point where it encourages more copycat terrorist attacks.
But I do find it ironic that the president says that the media is not covering these terrorist attacks that we've mentioned. He failed to mention and has said very little about the terrorist attack that occurred in Canada involving a white supremacist against a Muslim community where 6 people were killed. He said very little about that.
And I would suggest if you want to see some really good reporting about white supremacy, you should look at PBS. Last night they aired a great American Experience documentary on Oklahoma City, all that led up to the Oklahoma City bombing. Was it 30 years ago now? Right. And they have another
I don't think it was quite. I was in high school
when Bill Clinton was president.
Yeah, I was in high school, so maybe 20.
They have another documentary that's
25
coming out next Tuesday on Ruby Ridge, which is another one of these, one of the instances that crystallize sort of the white supremacist thinking about the U.S. government. So those are stories worth watching.
Okay, well, Trump did a big sit-down with Fox News' Bill O'Reilly that aired right before Sunday night's Super Bowl game. And during that interview, O'Reilly asked him some pointed questions about our relationship with Russia and his, personally, with Vladimir Putin. During that interview, O'Reilly called Putin a killer, putting a graphic on screen listing a handful of people whose deaths have been attributed to the Putin regime. As you can imagine, that didn't do much to please the Kremlin, and the Russian government demanded an apology. This was how Bill O'Reilly addressed that request Monday night.
Apparently, the Putin administration in Moscow demanding that I, your humble correspondent, apologize for saying old Vlad is a killer. So I'm working on that apology, but it may take a little time. Might want to check in with me around 2023.
Now, mind you, O'Reilly isn't going to be one who's going to be quick to apologize for much of anything that he says, but your thoughts on this response?
Well, I mean, first of all, as somebody who basically apologizes for the president a lot, good for Bill O'Reilly. I mean, first of all, for pressing the president on this in a high-profile interview, and frankly, for telling off the Russian government. I mean, the president, unfortunately, isn't inclined to say the same kinds of things. He was basically equating the U.S. government killing lots of people with Vladimir Putin allegedly trying to have his political opponents done away with. But, you know, Barack Obama, for example, wasn't ordering the deaths of any Americans at the same time that Vladimir Putin was pretty obviously ordering the deaths, say, of former KGB agents by having them poisoned in London. So I don't think there's an equivalency there.
Well, what I think is even more telling about this is, you know, President Trump's response, which is, you know, the United States is not, you know,
we're not perfect.
We're
our
not
hands
perfect.
aren't exactly
you know,
clean
we're not
either.
innocent. Yeah, well, our hands aren't clean, and so I'm looking at it. I'm going like, okay, where are you going with that? You know, and what I didn't see, which I wish I would have, and maybe wouldn't get it from O'Reilly, but maybe someone else, is to press the president on. What do you mean by that? Are you talking about torture? Are you talking about we're going to reopen the black sites, which is one of the things that you've been talking about doing? You know, are we headed down that road again? You know, so I would have wanted to hear more about that, but I am not surprised that Bill O'Reilly is basically saying, you're not getting an apology from me, Vladimir Putin. It's not coming.
I think it's also interesting that even in demanding an apology, the spokesman for the Kremlin, Dmitry Peskov, said that Fox News was a respected TV company. Now, this is the same guy, Peskov, who features prominently in that leaked report, you know, the intelligence report that the media are not reporting on, most of us, because you can't verify the claims.
Right.
He plays a very prominent role in that report.
Yeah.
Okay, well, the television ratings for Sunday night's Super Bowl came in at somewhere in the ballpark of about 111 million viewers. That's down a little bit from last year. Still, that is a lot of eyeballs on what became a pretty politically charged football telecast.
Warum bist du aus Deutschland?
I want to prove it.
Welcome to America. You don't want to hear. Go back home.
That was an excerpt from the Budweiser ad, one of many that had some not so subtle political undertones. This one was pretty much pro-immigration, the same with one from Airbnb.
That they rushed to the air.
That they rushed to air. But then there was that 84 Lumber ad that really has people scratching their heads a little bit.
Yeah, that one seemed to go after the issue of the wall and of people trying to make their way into the country, not legally, for a better life. And 84 Lumber is getting a lot of pushback on that. But then they're also getting a lot of support because there are people out there who are saying, wait a minute, this is a part of our immigrant past as well. So you had the Budweiser ad on one part, which was showing that part of immigration coming in through New York, and then you had this other one that was showing another part of our immigration history, which is probably more current.
Well, we'd love to play some of it for you, but it doesn't have any dialogue, so that doesn't go so well on the radio. You can watch the whole thing, both what aired on TV and what's available online on our Links blog.
Yeah, the interesting thing about the 84 Lumber commercial, first of all, it was Fox would not allow them to air the original ad. They had to cut it back to a 90-second version. They had to take out the images of the wall. So you could be talking about political censorship on the Super Bowl. But the other thing that I think is really interesting, you're right, Ernest, there were people who are pro-immigration or against the president's idea of building a wall who thought this was a great commercial. There were people on the president's side who were saying, oh, this is terrible. Why are they inserting themselves into this issue? But if you talk to the woman who owns 84 Lumber, as a lot of different media companies did.
A Trump supporter.
She's a Trump supporter. She voted for Trump. She said she got the idea for the door in the wall from President Trump and his campaign, and that frankly, she said this was an ad about, quote, legal immigration. Now, maybe she's trying to have it both ways because they were also trying to say, we employ people who have that kind of hard-working ethics. So maybe it wasn't as clean as she put it out to be, but people bring their own biases to how they interpret these ads.
And you saw a lot of that in these types of ads, which is it allowed the viewer to make a decision on whether or not they agreed with the ad or didn't agree with the ad or their own interpretation of it, which to me makes the ad much more authentic than just trying to be black and white or play down the middle.
I can say, too, that, we all know that no matter what sort of the hidden messages might be in some of these commercials, people advertise on the Super Bowl for two reasons, brand identification and to make money. And if you even look at the Budweiser ad, which did show, the story of Adolphus Bush and how he came here as an immigrant and how some people said go home, this was a commercial aimed at repairing Budweiser's image as an American beer, right? Because they're owned by InBev, this huge multinational conglomerate that also owns, I think, the Miller brand. So it's a big multinational company. And this was only one ad trying to say, hey, this is an American story about an American beer.
So I will admit I'm not the biggest football fan. Super Bowl, frankly, if it's on in my household, it's so that I don't miss the next wardrobe malfunction or the next power outage that kind of becomes Super Bowl pop culture. So maybe I'm not watching it so carefully, but do you remember a Super Bowl that had so many politically motivated ads?
Not back to back to back. And I think what's happening here is that our politics and the political discourse is bleeding into almost everything. And I think that what's happening now is that you have advertisers trying to, as Mike said, they're trying to take advantage and have their brand as a part of this discourse. The problem is, how do you do that and not cause a problem with one segment of your audience?
You end up alienating the other part of your constituency or your clientele.
But I wonder if the motivation was to talk about political issues, or if the motivation was to cut through all the clutter in a time when we're so polarized politically. Maybe you're going to get a little pushback, but bringing that into the message made it more likely that more people would attend.
And I think it's all about, look, we are a part of what's going on here, and we may not take one side or the other, but we are a part of the culture, and that's what we're trying to get at. And I think that's what some of the ads are, but then not all of them. I mean, some of them were the usual funny, the Spuds McKenzie for Bud Light and that sort of thing. So you had a mix of both the serious and the funny.
I will say this, I don't think I knew until Sunday night that maybe I am a Lady Gaga fan. I kind of realized as she sang that whole medley that I kind of like each of those songs. Fox put a 5-second delay on her performances, really anything that wasn't game action, partially out of fear of what happens if there's the Janet Jackson wardrobe malfunction again, but also because there was a lot of uncertainty about what she was going to do and if she was going to politicize her performance. Yes, it started out with, this land is your land, with the drones, with the flag, and then, dropping down into the stadium. What was interesting about her performance, maybe it isn't even about the performance, but the coverage of the performance and how different publications said, heck yeah, that was political. Heck no, that wasn't political. And it depends on who you are and what your perspective is.
Are you
how
surprised at how that broke out?
Right.
So you had a lot of media that said it wasn't political at all, and Fox News and some of the conservative organizations say it wasn't, and yet you had others who wanted to see a political message in there because she sang one of her anthems, the LGBT song Born This Way. Oh, well, there was obviously a message in there. It depends on whether you wanted to see
the headline in Teen Vogue,
Right. And
the only way you say this wasn't political is if you are a white cisgender straight man.
But I think you're seeing this in all of our media, and it's something that we're going to have to get used to, or the media is going to have to say, wait a minute, we need to go in another direction. And that hasn't happened yet. We've talked about that on the show for the last several months.
Well, there was a great cartoon in the New Yorker last week. There were two people talking as they walk down the street, with one saying to the other, "My desire to be well informed is currently at odds with my desire to remain sane." It's not an uncommon sentiment right now among rabid news consumers that we kind of have this weird addiction to the continued content, the continued information. At the same time, consuming it's beginning to wear us all down.
It is. I mean, I had a conversation with my daughter this morning, and she said, I just can't read the news every day anymore like I used to. And she's a rabid news consumer. She said it's just one sort of dysfunctional story after another, and it's starting to wear me down. And I basically said, well, then don't read it. I mean, and I've gotten to that point myself where I just sort of, I read a couple of stories and I stop, and then I move on and I do something else, because after a while, it does become sort of this on and on and on kind of dysfunction, and nothing seems to be working kind of mentality can seep in.
I wonder if at this point in time, though, if you're a Trump supporter, you might have a different attitude about how this is all playing out, and whether you're tired of it or whether it's driving you insane, as the cartoon suggested. I mean, it seems to me more generally, it's, as you were mentioning, Amy, we have this divided notion of, well, it's like saying, I don't want to see all this crime news on TV, but the ratings sure spike when they run lots of it. So, maybe it's that rubbernecking syndrome there. And I think maybe it's also interesting to point out that there are some stories we get tired of seeing that depress us, that make us think, I'm going to go insane. But look, on the very same day that we're talking about this, last night we had the hearing before the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals in San Francisco, hearing legal arguments about President Trump's immigration order. And there were some estimates of at least 1 million people were listening to an audio live stream on Facebook or YouTube, or the networks were running it with, they were running the audio and talking over it. Some stories that would seem like they would be kind of obscure, like a legal hearing, people are interested in knowing more
and we haven't seen that level of interest in an audio-only argument made before a court since Bush Gore.
Right.
Well, not that many of them are available, first of all, but and you had social media picking it up, and it was about an important topic. The New York Times had a live feed also kind of doing live running commentary on that too. How do we, though, as news organizations, how do we as journalists keep people interested and keep from being Eeyore on Winnie the Pooh?
Well, I think one of the things
Eeyore always being
But I think one of the things that you do is, your coverage and how you report the news has to be diverse. So it can't all be about these weighty issues. You also have to bring in other types of news, and I think the news media is going to have to do a better job of doing that, and not get so fixated on the things that divide us, and maybe bring in some stories that actually show the the positive side, if you want to call it that. Just real life. What are people doing? What are people going through that's not so divisive?
Well, and the news media have to cover what the president does, for example,
sure.
But there's also a diversity of our approach to the coverage, right? If it's just going to be constantly, he says this, she says that, the president says the media are doing this, the media deny that it's happening, that gets tiring and depressing. But there are other ways to approach these stories, telling them through the eyes of real people, for example, or just being more imaginative about the way we tell them that could cause people to be interested.
To me, one of the best ways to do that is to actually, like Mike just said, talk to real people, not so much the people who have an agenda and you know they have an agenda. Go out and talk to real people who to them the whole thing is much more complex than a he say, she say.
Okay, well, as we're talking about and thinking about where and how to change up our media diets, there are some things to think about, namely the source and tone of the coverage that you are selecting, and being aware enough to know the difference between fake news and satire. I think we've gotten to the point where most people know that National Lampoons and The Onion, those are satire. They get a laugh because, well, in the words of Homer Simpson, what they publish is funny because it's true. But not all satire is as widely known or as widely labeled. Take, for instance, Andy Borowitz. If you didn't know that his New Yorker column was satire, you might rely on the trust that you have in that publication's other reporting and take what he's writing in his columns for truth.
Yeah, it's both funny and kind of sad at the same time that he has to label his satire now as not the news, or we had this other site that you posted on our links blog saying that we're satire for the wise and news for the dumb. That you actually have to brand it that way is really kind of sad. Satire, on the other hand, is making a really big rebound with what's going on politically. I mean, look at Saturday Night Live. Their ratings are higher than they've been for a long time. And for the most part, it's because of the skits they're doing satirizing the president and Sean Spicer and Kellyanne Conway and Steve Bannon. So there is definitely a market right now for satire, even though some people, quote, can't tell the difference between.
Well, I mean, we've all seen this. I mean, the best satire comes from truth. I mean, when you can actually...
Homer Simpson. It's funny because it's true.
It's funny because it's true. I mean, and so when you can sort of take that and go, but wait a minute, you just said this, and if we spin it a little bit, it's funny. I mean, Jon Stewart made a living off of this. I mean, a huge part of Comedy Central comes from this type of the material. So, I mean, I think it's going to be with us probably during the next 4 years, maybe 8 years, but I think you're also going to see it in other ways.
I think it's interesting because, Amy, we were just talking about, is there a different way to cover these stories or different types of stories
to
cover?
This is the way to do it.
And this is what, this is what John Oliver's trying to do with his show on HBO. He's coming back after a hiatus here this coming Sunday, for, this week tonight, right?
Yeah.
And he's tried to do stories, real stories, not just satire, about, in a funny way, about issues that are not so directly related to the campaigns. He says he wants to come back and do that again as he's launching another season. We'll see, but it's going to be hard to... he won't try to ignore what the president is saying, but if you really want to hew to that line that we're going to do something different, good luck.
Well, and there's a piece on our links blog. He had talked to some folks, and it was in Politico, that he's really trying to resist the urge to have his show become all Trump, all politics, all the time, because it becomes so easy to do. I know that's something, frankly, we've been trying to avoid doing too, and it's hard to do.
It is.
That said, we do have a story to talk about today that doesn't have to do with politics. Before we go, let's talk about the latest social media company to announce its plans to go public, Snap.
Some of the headline numbers that I think are important: 158 million daily active users, 25% of those are posting every day. The other thing that Snap is really pressing is this idea of engagement. It's not about the number of users they have, but it's about the engagement of the users that are on the platform.
So I've been on Snapchat just shy of about a year, and it is an engaging platform between the different lenses. If it's something you've been on where you can like vomit rainbows or add, dog ears and noses, there are a lot of bells and whistles in there that make Snapchatting and creating snaps fun, but there are also some really good ways in there to share news and information.
Yeah, I think so, and I would say that you use Snapchat regularly. I have it on my phone, but we are not the target demographic.
Oh, no,
for this app.
no. And at 39, I'm already way out of that demographic.
So it's obviously targeted at millennials. Right. I mean, it's taking advantage of the camera on the smartphone. Right. It was originally conceived to be an app where it's like you're having a real conversation with a person, and the media you create disappears, right. Whether it's sexting, as people were worrying about, or it's news. The idea is that it's not something that has a lasting memory in your app. It's you're having a real conversation with a real person. And I think that was a good insight from the guy that started Snap, and might be a reason why, as they're going through their IPO, they might actually get the billions of dollars they think they're worth.
I mean, I think initially they're going to be able to get that kind of money. The question is, are they going to be able to continue that? Are they going to be able to think a little bit further down the road as to how this is going to be used? I mean, if you just go back and look at the brief history of Snapchat, those little bitty videos that sort of go away after a while, now that's passé, and you go to these now you're up to using this. Well, what about when the vomiting rainbows and the ear things, when that goes away, what's going to be the next thing? You're going to have to keep that going.
One of the other limitations of Snapchat is that especially when news organizations are now trying to figure out ways to implement it into their workflows and into their delivery, there's no real way to know who your audience is or any kind of real metrics in terms of how many people you're reaching or when or how. Does that become a limitation in the business model when you're looking at it in terms of valuation and potential financial growth?
I mean, I think so, because, I mean, let's be honest, Snapchat or Snap, their parent company, it's not made any profits yet. They've been around for a couple of years now. And all of their money, almost all of their money, comes from advertising or sponsorship deals. And so if it's going to rely on advertising, then there have got to be some realistic metrics that, the media companies and the advertisers themselves are willing to say, I want to invest my time and talent on this platform. The other thing they've got going for them, though, is maybe they're not making money. Maybe they're relying all on advertising their business model, but their growth in terms of users is just going up exponentially. So they have, for now.
Is that right? I was going to say, is that about the app, or is that just because it's the new one? I mean, Facebook had that level of exponential growth maybe 5 or 6 or 10 years ago.
I mean, yes, but Facebook figured out through that growth phase how to create a business model that made sense for them, and they're raking in money, and it's mostly through advertising. I'm not saying Snap can't do that, but I think that the growth that they're on buys them a little time if they can figure it out.
And I think that they should use that time to try to figure out how to monetize that group that they have right now, and be able to maintain that as they move forward.
Okay, well, we are just about out of time for today. I'd like to thank you for spending the last half hour with us. You can read more about the topics we talked about today on our links blog. You can find that under the programs tab at kbia.org. Like us on Facebook or follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @viewsOnKBIA. These are all great ways to watch and listen to our program again, to leave us comments, questions, see previews of what we'll be talking about next week, and more. Our thanks to RJI's Lowell Thomas for directing today's show, and to Kyle Felling for handling the audio. Travis Myers, our associate producer. I'm Amy Simons. Be sure to join us again next week when we're back with you for another edition of Views of the News.